12 July 1943, 0640, near the Leningrad Front. The air smelled of damp pine and burnt fuel as distant artillery thumped across the early morning haze. Frost still clung to the edges of canvas tents, and a cold breeze carried the metallic scent of oil and scorched metal from the wreck lying in the grass ahead. A group of Soviet airmen moved cautiously toward the downed German fighter, boots crunching over broken branches and shallow puddles, the sound echoing softly in the quiet space between artillery volleys. They had been told a Focke-Wulf 190 had crash-landed almost intact, an impossibly rare prize. Now they were close enough to touch it, and the closer they came, the heavier the silence grew around them. The fighter's dark green paint was mottled with smoke and dirt, but its shape was unmistakable. Tight, compact, muscular. The kind of machine Soviet pilots feared, respected, and grudgingly admired. Steam hissed from the nose where hot engine metal met the cool morning air. The propeller was twisted, but the aircraft's wings, the real mystery, were intact. This was the first time many of these mechanics and pilots had ever seen the infamous butcher bird up close, rather than flashing past him in the sky at terrifying speeds. For months, Soviet pilots flying Yak-1s, Yak-7s, and the newer Yak-9s had reported startling encounters. They spoke of brief, brutal confrontations where their aircraft seemed to shear apart under the Focke-Wulf's cannon bursts. Entire wing panels vanished in an instant. Control surfaces ripped away as if made of thin fabric. Survivors described it in simple, painful words. It cut the Yak open like a knife through paper. Commanders needed answers. Engineers needed proof. And now, lying here in the grass, was the machine capable of doing it. Moments earlier, a team had already pulled the wounded German pilot from the cockpit. He survived the crash, but was shaken and silent, still gripping his flight gloves as if the battle were happening in his mind again. His FW-190, however, spoke clearly for itself, and it was about to reveal secrets the Soviets had only guessed at. As the airmen circled the aircraft, the morning sun finally rose over the tree line, glinting against the metal skin. Every detail seemed to shout a challenge. The stubby wings hiding enormous firepower, the rugged radio engine that shrugged off damage the way lighter Soviet fighters never could, the reinforced cockpit built like a steel prison. It didn't take long before anticipation turned into focused tension. They were here for one reason: to see what made this machine so deadly. One mechanic slid his hand along the wing root, feeling the cold rivets under his fingertips. Another wiped the soot from a gun port with a gloved thumb. They were preparing to open the access panels. The men exchanged glances, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Was the firepower really as monstrous as pilots claimed? Was it truly possible for a single burst to tear apart a Yak as if it were nothing? The officer in charge nodded once. Panels were unlatched. Metal hinges creaked. And when the first section of the wing opened, the airmen froze, not from fear, but from pure disbelief. But before reaching that moment of revelation, the story must step back months earlier into the skies where Soviet pilots first understood that something had changed. Because to grasp the shock these men felt on the ground, you must first understand the shock their comrades felt in the air. The FW-190 had arrived on the Eastern Front in late 1942, and from the first encounters, Soviet pilots sensed they were facing a new kind of threat. Its wide-track landing gear gave German pilots confidence on rough frontline airstrips. Its BMW 801 radio engine gave it resilience. A burst of small-caliber fire that would cripple a Messerschmitt barely scratched this aircraft. And then there was its firepower. Two 13mm MG-131 machine guns above the engine, and four 20mm cannons in the wings, often MG-151/20s, sometimes mixed with older MG-FF-Ms depending on the variant. Together, they formed the concentrated, devastating package. Reports from Yak and Lag fighters painted the same picture again and again. A German pilot waited in a shallow dive. The Soviet pilot tried to climb or turn. A short burst flashed from the wing roots of the Focke-Wulf, and then sudden chaos. Holes big enough to put a fist through, buckled spars, torn flaps, control cable sliced in two. The Yak series, built for agility and lightness, simply could not absorb this kind of punishment. Engineers at Soviet test centers heard the stories, but needed proof. The Germans rarely left their aircraft intact. When they were shot down, they burned. When they crash-landed, they broke apart. And when pilots tried to escape over Soviet lines, they destroyed anything they could. It was a game of secrecy and survival. But in July 1943, fortune changed. An FW-190A4, forced down after suffering engine damage during a low-altitude fight, skidded across a marshy field near the Leningrad Front. The pilot survived. The aircraft did too. Far better than anyone expected. Reinforced landing gear and a tough airframe had absorbed the impact. The wings were dirty, the belly was dented, but nothing vital appeared destroyed. Word reached the nearest Soviet aviation regiment by noon. Mechanics, intelligence officers, pilots, and armament specialists traveled to the site. They set up ropes around the crash area. Soldiers posted guards. For hours, teams inspected the fuselage from the outside, whispering in small groups, sketching details, taking measurements, and photographing the aircraft with handheld cameras. But all of that was preparation. The real discovery, the moment Soviet airmen later recalled as the day we understood why our fighters fell so fast, began once the access panels were opened and the weapons inside were revealed. The documentary's focus narrows on that pivotal morning because it marks one of the most important intelligence moments for the Soviet Air Force on the Eastern Front. Not only did they gain insights into the German fighters' armament, they also confirmed the testimonies of pilots who felt helpless against the FW-190's bursts. The Yak fighters, made of lightweight aluminum and wood, simply weren't designed to withstand high-velocity 20mm cannon shells that exploded inside the structure. Soviet engineers had suspected much. Now they would witness it firsthand. Meanwhile, this captured aircraft would soon be taken to the Leningrad Air Technical Research Base, and later to the NII VVS Evaluation Center, where it would undergo rigorous testing, engine run-ups, structural analysis, even mock firing demonstrations. Each stage brought new revelations about why the FW-190 caused such devastating losses in the early years of its deployment. But on morning 12 July, before the testing facilities and before the reports, everything began with a group of airmen standing around the silent, still warm fighter resting in the grass. The mist was still rising, the sun was climbing, and the men were ready to uncover the secrets that had haunted their comrades. A mechanic reached for the wing panel. The officer nodded once. The hinge clicked. The metal rose, and the true firepower of the Focke-Wulf came into view. The breath of several men caught at once. Inside the wing, neatly mounted, was the heart of the machine's reputation, the MG-151/20 cannon installation, clean, compact, and engineered with chilling precision. The feed chutes, the ammunition drums, the recoil mounts, everything built for maximum reliability. And this was only the beginning of what they were about to learn. The day was just starting, and so was the shock. The sun was sinking low when the captured FW-190 finally arrived at the Soviet testing grounds. The sky burned orange, casting long shadows across the concrete apron. Mechanics rolled the battered German fighter into a hangar lit by rows of humming lamps. The air smelled of engine oil, cold metal, and the faint mustiness of documents piled on desks in the corner. Here, the machine would undergo the most thorough examination any foreign aircraft had received on the Eastern Front. As the hangar doors clanged shut, the space filled with a tense, anticipatory quiet. Engineers in overalls took their positions. Test pilots stood nearby with clipboards. Intelligence officers watched silently from behind them, knowing that the next hours would shape not just understanding, but strategy. The first round of testing began with the weapons. Cannons were cleaned and measured. Feed chutes were disassembled. Ammunition was cataloged and weighed. Each shell casing was examined for markings and composition. The MG-151/20 cannon, now removed from its wing cradle, rested on a padded table under a hanging lamp, its metal glinting like a predator's tooth. An armament specialist stepped forward, picked up a Minen-Geschoss round, and rotated it slowly in his hand. Its thin-walled design was unlike anything the Soviets produced. The explosive cavity inside was enormous, made possible only because German engineers had developed a metal that was strong enough to maintain structural integrity, but thin enough to hold more explosive filler. The specialist placed the shell down and spoke quietly. "This isn't just ammunition, it's engineering meant to erase an airplane." Those words hung in the air. Everyone felt them. Next came the firing tests, simulated bursts using inert mechanisms to measure rate of fire and recoil. The machine gun synchronizer system was inspected for reliability. When the MG 151/20 cycled under testing conditions, the rhythmic clacking echoed around the hangar like a heartbeat. It wasn't loud, but it was unnervingly confident. Meanwhile, engineers rotated to the engine bay. They studied the BMW 801 radio, examining the cowl flaps, oil cooling system, and ignition harness. The engine was heavy, rugged, and filled with redundancy. A single bullet hole in a coolant line could cripple a yak instantly. But here, this radial engine could be hit multiple times and remain operational long enough for its pilot to dive away or return home. One engineer shook his head slightly as he inspected the armored ring around the forward engine section. He had read earlier reports claiming the FW-190 was nearly immune to small caliber fire from the front. Here, he found the physical proof to match those claims. But the greatest moment, the moment that shocked the entire evaluation team, came when they reassembled the MG 151/20 into a test rig and fired explosive rounds into structural mock-ups of Yak wing panels. Engineers had built these mock-ups based on real Yak 1 and Yak 7 construction, aluminum skins stretched over wooden ribs and spurs. 4 shells were fired. Only 4. Each impact produced a sharp flash, followed by a bloom of splinters and metal fragments. The first round blasted a hole roughly the size of a fist. The second round tore the wooden spur behind it into splinters. The third round detonated deep inside the panel, creating a cavity that looked like it had been punched out by an invisible hammer. And the fourth, it ripped nearly the entire corner off the mock-up. The blast patterns matched almost perfectly with the combat damage photographs the Soviet Air Force had collected over the past year. Watching from behind the protective glass shield, a test pilot whispered a single phrase under his breath. That's why they fall apart. That night, long after the firing tests ended, the evaluation team filed formal reports. They wrote about the destructive capability of the Minen Geschoss rounds. They wrote about the FW-190's rugged construction, its roll rate, its armor, its engine durability, and the tactical implications of its firepower. Those reports were delivered to frontline regiments within weeks. Pilots were warned to avoid the frontal passes. They were told to use vertical maneuvers, teamwork, and patience. They were reminded that this aircraft wasn't invincible, but it punished the careless. Thousands of airmen would read those reports before their next missions. For many, the knowledge inside them saved lives. As the tests continued, Soviet officers realized something profound. Understanding the strengths of the FW-190 also revealed its vulnerabilities. Its heavy radial engine created drag in climbing turns. Its weight made it lose energy quickly in vertical maneuvers. Its excellent roll rate masked the fact that once neutralized, it required space to regain momentum. These insights empowered Yak pilots to adapt, and adapt they did. By 1944, improved Yak-3 fighters, especially the Yak-3, entered combat in significant numbers. Lighter, faster in the low-altitude band where most Eastern Front fights occurred, and armed with concentrated center-line weaponry, the Yak-3 became a formidable opponent for the German fighter. Soviet pilots learned to avoid the FW-190's initial burst, force it into rolling contests, and trap it when it lost energy. But the seeds of that evolution, the shift in tactics, the growing confidence, were planted the day Soviet airmen opened the wings of the downed FW-190 and saw the weapons that had haunted them. Back in the testing hangar, after days of disassembly and analysis, the German fighters' components were laid out neatly on cloth-covered tables. Each part told a story. The cannon barrels, thick and cold to the touch. The empty shell casings with faint scorch marks. The armored canopy glass, the battered wing ribs, the reinforced landing gear. Mechanics walked by the table slowly, absorbing the details. A yak pilot visiting the facility paused beside the MG-151/20 lying open on the table. He crouched down, ran his hand cautiously along the housing, and stared at the breach with a mixture of curiosity and anger. His friends had been killed by weapons just like this. But instead of bitterness, what washed over him was determination. They now understood the threat, and knowing the threat meant knowing how to survive it. Meanwhile, at the front, Soviet squadrons flying Yak-9s and La-5FN began adjusting their formations. They avoided the lethal range of the FW-190's cannon convergence zone. They changed their standard diving angles. They kept radio calls tighter, cleaner. They learned to force the FW-190 into vertical climbs, where the heavy radial engines struggled. These adaptations didn't eliminate losses, but they reduced them. And gradually, the once dominant FW-190 began to lose some of its edge. Still, the memory of the first examination lingered among the mechanics and pilots who witnessed it. Many would mention it years later in memoirs and interviews. They described how seeing the MG-151/20 in person changed everything. They spoke of the sudden clarity, how the puzzle pieces finally fit together. And they remembered the feeling of opening that wing panel and seeing the weapon that cut their friend's aircraft apart. For some, the sight was sobering. For others, motivating. But for all of them, it marked a turning point. As the war dragged deeper into 1944, the skies over the Eastern Front transformed. Soviet industry increased production. New fighters entered service. German units, strained and increasingly outnumbered, fought with desperation. But through it all, the lessons learned from that single captured FW-190 continued to shape Soviet tactics. One of the engineers involved in the testing would later write in his report, "The FW-190 showed us our own limits, and in showing us our limits, it pushed us beyond them." It's a sentiment that echoes across aviation history. Understanding the enemy's strengths doesn't just reveal their power, it reveals your own potential. Near the end of the war, as Soviet fighters swept deeper into occupied Europe, many pilots felt they had finally evened the scales. But they never forgot that moment in 1943 when they first opened the FW-190's wings and saw the weapons inside. To them, it wasn't simply a mechanical discovery. It was a reminder of the thin line between life and death in the skies, how a split-second burst could change everything. And it was a reminder of the courage it took to climb into a Yak, knowing what awaited them if a German pilot squeezed the trigger first. Years after the war, as restored aircraft went on display in museums, veterans would sometimes stand quietly beside the FW-190 exhibits. Younger visitors might see only a machine, but the veterans saw something else, a turning point, a hard-earned lesson, a moment of clarity forged in metal and fire. This story of a downed FW-190, of Soviet airmen opening its wings, of engineers discovering its secrets, is more than an isolated wartime anecdote. It captures the essence of aviation history, innovation driven by fear, adaptation born of necessity, and survival shaped by understanding. As the camera pulls back from the testing hangar, as the lights dim and the echoes fade, the message remains clear. Behind every aircraft of the Second World War lies a human story, a story of men who faced the unknown, confronted it, learned from it, and carried those lessons into the sky. And for viewers watching now, the same question quietly lingers. What hidden detail, what unseen piece of knowledge might change the way you understand the past? If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts. Many families still carry memories of those who flew, fought, or fell. Their stories deserve to be remembered, discussed. The cool morning air clung to the men's jackets as they leaned in, their breaths hanging in faint white puffs over the open wing bay. What lay inside the FW-190's structure did not just surprise them, it humbled them. The cannons were not messy assemblies of pipes and springs like the older German MG-FF guns many Soviet mechanics recognized. These were compact, refined, brutally efficient machines of destruction. The MG-151/20 cannon rested in a snug cradle, the feed system curved neatly in a way that made sense even to the untrained eye. There was precision here, precision the Soviets had rarely seen up close. The cannon's breech block was robust but remarkably streamlined. Everything about the weapon suggested one purpose: delivering high-explosive shells at a rate and velocity that turned dogfights into brief, lethal encounters. A mechanic reached in and tapped the feed chute gently with a knuckle. The metal gave a deep, confident sound. Another inspected the recoil system and exhaled quietly, as if whispering to himself, "No wonder." Soviet pilots had long wondered how a German burst could rip open a Yak wing in an instant. Here was the answer. The MG-151/20, firing explosive Minengeschoss rounds, could punch through light alloy skin, detonate inside the structure, and send shrapnel through spars and ribs, sometimes blowing entire sections free in the blink of an eye. The blast force was internal, where aircraft were most vulnerable, and unlike many earlier cannons, this one fired reliably even under the high G-loads of tight combat maneuvering. As the airmen processed what they were seeing, another panel came loose on the opposite wing. More cannons, more ammunition belts. It almost felt excessive. Soviet fighters of the Yak series relied on a single 20mm or 23mm cannon and one or two machine guns near the nose. The FW-190, by contrast, carried this destructive payload in both wings, plus two heavy machine guns above the engine. It was an air-to-air weapon system built to overwhelm. One of the officers stepped back, rubbing the stubble on his chin. His eyes narrowed as he traced the line of the wing's leading edge. Here, he thought, was the core of the machine's terrifying reputation among Soviet pilots. The aircraft did not just fire, it delivered a synchronized storm of shells, designed to tear apart whatever lay in front of it. Nearby, another group of men clustered around the fuselage, now examining the engine cowling. When it came off, a different kind of shock spread through the mechanics. The BMW 801 radial engine, wide and heavy, filled the space almost completely. This was the heart of the FW-190's toughness. Soviet fighters built around liquid-cooled inline engines were vulnerable to a single well-placed bullet in the coolant system, but this radial, this rugged, star-shaped monster, could take hits and keep running, even through the worst frontline conditions. A mechanic ran his hand along the engine mount and muttered under his breath. The Germans had armored the FW-190 in key locations, around the cockpit, behind the pilot, at the fuel tank, even partially around the engine. These weren't luxury design choices, these were battlefield necessities, engineered down to the last detail. But the true revelation of the morning came when one of the mechanics found the fired shell casings still in the wing. They were lodged in the ejection chute and smelled faintly of burnt propellant. Carefully, he extracted one and held it in the sunlight. The casing was brass, long and heavy. The engraved markings were still visible. MG-151/20. The officer in charge turned the casing over in his hand. He had seen damage reports from Yak regiments describing wings sliced off in mid-flight, tails severed cleanly, fuselages torn open. Now holding the physical evidence, those reports no longer sounded exaggerated. He looked at the wing and whispered to no one in particular, "This is how they cut us apart." The group began speaking in low, urgent voices. They discussed the odds Soviet pilots faced when approaching frontal engagements. They talked about how the FW-190's guns were harmonized, calibrated to converge their bullets and shells at a specific distance, producing maximum destructive effect. Soviet fighters, lighter and agile, depended on dogfighting at close range. The German aircraft, however, could kill at medium range with devastating accuracy. And there was another factor: rate of fire. The cannons fired quickly enough that a 1-second burst could deliver multiple explosive shells. In the chaos of battle, 1 second was everything. Meanwhile, as the first team continued identifying weapons and armor, another group climbed into the cockpit. They were struck by the ergonomics: wide gauges, clean layout, thick armored glass, a canopy offering excellent visibility. A pilot could quickly read instruments without searching. Even the control stick felt sturdy and responsive. It was a cockpit built for combat efficiency, not comfort, but it was comfortable in its clarity. A test pilot in the group spoke quietly to the others. He had heard from Allied briefings passed through Lend-Lease channels that the FW-190 was easier to fly than many Soviet fighters. Now, sitting in the cockpit, he could see why. Controls were balanced, instruments were large, even the canopy crank was placed within easy reach. Every detail of the fighter seemed to confirm the reports that had reached Soviet command months earlier. The FW-190 was one of the most feared air-to-air weapon systems in the world. By midday, trucks and cranes had arrived to begin transport of the aircraft to the testing facility. Soldiers secured the site and prepared to lift the fighter from the mud. As they worked, Soviet pilots meanwhile gathered near the wreck, quietly discussing their own experiences battling FW-190s. One pilot, a Yak-7 veteran, spoke softly about the first time he encountered the German fighter. He described the flash of yellow nose markings, the howl of the radio engine, and then the sudden terrifying sensation of his wing disappearing under him. He had lived only because he managed to crash land in friendly territory. His aircraft had been shredded by 2 short bursts. Another pilot described a duel over the Volkhov River where a Yak-9 turned tightly behind an FW-190, only to lose a chunk of the elevator when a single explosive shell detonated near the tail. The Yak pilot made it back, but only barely. When ground crews inspected the aircraft, they found internal ribs shattered, control cables hanging loose, and splintered wood along the stabilizer. Listening to these stories while standing beside the open wings of the fallen fighter created a moment of chilling clarity. What pilots had reported from the sky was now reflected in cold metal and engineered precision. Meanwhile, back at the Soviet testing center, engineers were preparing for the arrival of the captured aircraft. Their goals were simple: determine the FW-190's exact strengths and weaknesses, compare it to Soviet and Allied fighters, and develop countertactics. When the aircraft arrived days later, they immediately began their analysis. They inspected the guns, confirmed the ammunition types, tested the engine's remaining performance, and evaluated the armor layout. The test results were alarming but invaluable. Engineers confirmed that the explosive Meningeschoss rounds used by the MG-151/20 were far more destructive than Soviet high-explosive rounds of similar caliber, due to their thin walls and large explosive charges. They also confirmed that the FW-190's roll rate was exceptionally high, so high in fact that the aircraft could escape many turning engagements by simply rolling and diving away. These tests soon reached frontline units in the form of briefings and tactical advice. Pilots were instructed to avoid frontal passes at all costs. The FW-190's firepower was simply too overwhelming. Instead, they were encouraged to engage from angles minimizing exposure to the wing-mounted cannons, diving attacks, quick strikes, and teamwork. They were also told to watch for the German pilot's habit of rolling aggressively to escape and to anticipate it. Meanwhile, as the test teams continued identifying weapons and armor, another group climbed into the cockpit. They were struck by the ergonomics: wide gauges, clean layout, thick armored glass, a canopy offering excellent visibility. A pilot could quickly read instruments without searching. Even the control stick felt sturdy and responsive. It was a cockpit built for combat efficiency, not comfort, but it was comfortable in its clarity. A test pilot in the group spoke quietly to the others. He had heard from Allied briefings passed through Lend-Lease channels that the FW-190 was easier to fly than many Soviet fighters. Now, sitting in the cockpit, he could see why. Controls were balanced, instruments were large, even the canopy crank was placed within easy reach. Every detail of the fighter seemed to confirm the reports that had reached Soviet command months earlier. The FW-190 was one of the most feared air-to-air weapon systems in the world. By midday, trucks and cranes had arrived to begin transport of the aircraft to the testing facility. Soldiers secured the site and prepared to lift the fighter from the mud. As they worked, Soviet pilots meanwhile gathered near the wreck, quietly discussing their own experiences battling FW-190s. One pilot, a Yak-7 veteran, spoke softly about the first time he encountered the German fighter. He described the flash of yellow nose markings, the howl of the radio engine, and then the sudden terrifying sensation of his wing disappearing under him. He had lived only because he managed to crash land in friendly territory. His aircraft had been shredded by 2 short bursts. Another pilot described a duel over the Volkhov River where a Yak-9 turned tightly behind an FW-190, only to lose a chunk of the elevator when a single explosive shell detonated near the tail.
The yak pilot made it back, but only barely. When ground crews inspected the aircraft, they found internal ribs shattered, control cables hanging loose, and splintered wood along the stabilizer. Listening to these stories while standing beside the open wings of the fallen fighter created a moment of chilling clarity. What pilots had reported from the sky was now reflected in cold metal and engineered precision. Meanwhile, back at the Soviet testing center, engineers were preparing for the arrival of the captured aircraft. Their goals were simple: